for joining us. Welcome to our presentation, Beyond the Buzzword, Challenging Assumptions and Building Culturally Responsive Classroom Management as a Community Newcomer. We chose this title because the term culturally responsive classroom management can kind of be thrown around a lot and used frequently without a lot of people diving into what it actually means. And so we're going to go beyond this buzzword and talk about what it means for us as teachers and how we can apply it to our own lives and our own practice. So in this presentation, we're first going to have an overview of what it means to be a community newcomer and what cultural disequilibrium is, before we kind of go into an overview of the historical background and some of the structural racism and injustice present in the educational system. Next, we'll talk about what you can do right now watching this video with the inner work and the personal transformation before talking about how you can build relationships and enter into your community humbly. Finally, we're going to leave you with a set of best practices and best mindsets to kind of reframe how you think about classroom management, and so you can take those practices and those mindsets with you in the classroom in the fall to be a confident, culturally responsive classroom manager. Now, at the outset of this presentation, we want to establish some conversational norms. We're going to talk a lot about race and identity, and this is uncomfortable stuff to talk about. So our norms are no blame, no shame, no guilt. All of us here in this conversation, we are all driving in the same direction. We all want what is best for our students, and we are learning together. And so we recognize that we are not experts and that what we say cannot be universalized for every student and for every school. Please take this presentation and our research as a starting point to point you to the literature, to point you to the experts, and to kind of be this place for you to jump off and do more research on your own. But these are important norms to establish right as we begin. Now, to kind of set a framework for what it means to be a community newcomer, I want to explain the story of Martha Crago, who was a non-Inuit speech pathologist serving at an Inuit school in Canada. And so the principal, who was a non-Inuit at this school, reached out to Martha and gave a list of students to her that she recommended for speech pathology intervention. And next to names of several students, the principal wrote, "These children do not speak in class." And so Martha took this list of students and she asked an Inuit teacher. She asked how these students were doing in their proficiency with their native language. And the Inuit teacher turned to Martha and said, "Well-raised Inuit children should not speak in class. They should be learning by looking and listening." Sharing this story about Martha is an important context, an important example for us in this presentation. The reality is that we will all be Martha in some way. And if you're a second-year teacher, I'm sure that we can look back and point to several different examples when we might have been Martha or the principal. Consider the fact that they misconstrued these children's behavior for something that was similar to a developmental delay or a speech impediment, when all the children's behavior was a manifestation of a cultural norm or difference. This is important to keep in our minds and to recognize that the cultural differences between us and our students matter. We will use the term cultural disequilibrium to describe that mismatch between your life and your experience and your students' lives and their experience. This is not an inherently negative reality, but it is a reality that we need to name, because we need to recognize that mismatch and those differences of experience will influence how we view behavior and how we manage our classroom. So in order to move from this state of cultural disequilibrium that you will face as a newcomer, or you have faced already, we can break down, and we'll use this metaphor of wearing cultural glasses. And what this means is becoming aware that all of our management practices, from what we deem as respectful behavior, to being a caring teacher, to what active participation looks like, those things we view through the lens of our own cultural experience, through our own upbringing and our own education. And so to recognize that we are wearing cultural glasses is that first step. Now, to look at step 2, we can actually look to Martha for a good example of what it means to take off those cultural glasses and to try to look through your students. Martha didn't persist in viewing those Inuit children who didn't speak in class negatively. She turned to the Inuit teacher at her school for advice and for insight, and she took off her own cultural lens to try to look through her students. These two principles are essential to being a culturally responsive classroom manager. And from these two comes number 3, which is manage accordingly. This is intentionally broad because there is no one size fits all step 3. There is no universal, this will work for every classroom. You need to first see yourself as a cultural person and see behavior as culturally driven to be an effective, culturally responsive classroom manager. So now we're going to turn it over to Emily, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the history behind this.
Yeah, so Maddie talked a little bit about lenses, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the historical lens. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the lens of critical race theory. And critical race theory is a theory that says that race is a way that society has organized itself from the beginning, especially specifically talking about America and the United States. And so we cannot grow up here without being influenced by the messages that the world around us sends to us. And so this is important because it shows us that education is not a newly racist institution. And the inequity and the segregation and the racist structures that education and schooling have in them are only the product of a society that holds systemic and oppressive norms. And so I know that's a lot of academic language, and I encourage you to read more about critical race theory, and we'll provide some resources for you on your takeaway sheet for you to do that. But what's most important for our presentation here, and for us as new teachers entering into new cultural spaces, is that the racist structures are there, right? They're there in the testing, in the teacher training, in the management practices. And so it's our job to be really conscious of those structures and to push back against them in the way that we present ourselves as a teacher and also in the way that we learn about our communities. So moving forward to look at kind of the history of the white savior teacher, and you might have heard that term before, white savior. And so the education system in the US has a long history of showing us this narrative of a white teacher that comes in to save students of color. And so if you look all the way back to white antebellum teachers who were literally trying to save their slave students and give them salvation by teaching them how to read the Bible. And then also American Indian boarding schools that were federal schools in the 19th and 20th century that's main aim was kill the Indian, save the man. And so this idea that white teachers were coming in and forcing assimilation of these native peoples to force them into white cultures so that they could be good citizens of the United States, right? And then we look at modern culture. So today the world's around us, and everywhere we look, there are billboards that show white teachers and students of color. And so you can look at the films Half Nelson, Dangerous Minds, Freedom Writers, and even national test scores, news reports about schools in different areas, schools in different demographics, that just really promote this narrative that tells us and informs us about how to think about students of color and white teachers. And then the last part is that we don't talk about it, right? So we have this school system that's oriented toward white cultures and needs, and we often don't point this out either to ourselves or to new teachers and show them ways of breaking out of those dominant narratives that history has set up for us. So just quickly, a visual representation of kind of the thing that Maddie was talking about before with cultural disequilibrium. There's this path where we start with 80% of white teachers in the United States are white. And that's just a fact, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Well, there might be something wrong with that, but there's nothing wrong with white teachers themselves. Then we look into how they're trained and how this dominant narrative of white cultures has shown them to downplay power, speak softly, and be non-assertive. And oftentimes, teacher training programs don't have that extra cultural training that teachers might need for the students that they're encountering in the schools that they might be entering. Then they encounter their students of color, and they struggle because these students don't perceive that they care. They don't respond well to their management techniques because they're not culturally aligned. And then there's this cultural disequilibrium that Maddie was talking about. That's the contradiction between expectation and reality that can do a lot of really horrible stuff for motivation, for teacher burnout. And yeah, it's just not a good situation. So what can we do about that not good situation? Where I'm going to turn it to Jess to talk about what we can start to do as inner work.
All right, so after hearing what Emily and Maddie have talked to us about, you might be thinking to yourself, what can I do in my classroom to be culturally responsive? And that's a great question, but before you think about your classroom, we want you to consider yourself first. And so here on the next slide is a quote from a culturally responsive classroom management scholar who calls for the inner work of teachers and calls for this inner transformation and reflection that must happen before being a community newcomer and before teaching at a new school. And so this inner work, he says, is the missing piece in the preparation of white teachers who will teach students of color, which is ultimately what brought us to this topic of conversation after our first year of teaching. And so on the next slide, we categorize these this inner work into 3 main action items that you can start doing today, right now. And these are challenging your assumptions, asking questions, and doing a little bit of unlearning. And so looking first at this first action item, what you can do right now, as I said, the first thing is to challenge your assumptions. And returning to what Maddie discussed earlier, you can do this by considering the cultural lens that you wear. And in our research, we came across some pretty frightening things about what white teachers may think about students of color before they enter into the classroom. And according to the research that we found, these teachers believed that students of color had a lower or slower ability to learn, and they used words like unmotivated, rougher, and violent to talk about their students. And we really urge you to move away from this deficit lens into a strengths-based or asset lens view of your students and their capabilities. And on the next slide, we have another action item for you for the inner work that we really encourage you to do. And that's to consider these topics of conversation as you enter into your school community. And these are great conversations to have with your ACE community members, your mentor teachers, and other trusted people in your community. And these topics on the screen are certainly not the limit of the conversations that you might consider having, but this is a great starting point. And finally, on the next slide, our last item for you to consider for your inner work is to encourage you to consider your conception of respect and how that may be based in white values. And one scholar interviewed a pair of white educators teaching in urban schools, and they each described their ideal respectful student as the quintessential white middle-class good student. And they used characteristics like passive, non-threatening towards authority, and rule-abiding to describe these students. And with these values and characteristics at the center of their conception of respect, they continued to face cultural disequilibrium. And now that we've talked about this kind of inner work, we're going to look forward and outwards towards the communities and families. And Shaughn's going to talk to us about that.
Thank you, Jess. So ACERs, it's really important that after you've committed to do this ongoing inner work, that you carry this knowledge and this perspective into your community. When focusing on developing a culturally responsive classroom management, you should obviously get to know your students' culture. Why is this important? It is important to learn and appreciate cultural capital, which is the culmination of knowledge, behaviors, and skills that a person demonstrates that is valued. And it is so important for the teacher to recognize this capital and pedagogically utilize it in the classroom so that they can enhance the student learning overall. So how can we do this as novice teachers and many of us going into communities that are brand new? So first things first, make a friend. Find a resource that is representative of the culture that is willing to support you. Studies reveal that the most common conflicts exist simply in differing expectations and definitions of what a successful education looks like. A friend or a member of the community can be really helpful in understanding what these expectations might look like. Also, it is so important to listen attentively and pay attention. Different communication methods might be used by different groups of people, so it is really important to be attentive to what is respectful and what is received well within your specific community. Finally, it is so important that you simply make the consistent effort. We know you have so much on your plate, but it is so important because studies show that students and families respond positively to a continuous active effort from the teacher to show care for the families. Families desire to be included in the daily life of their child's education. And so studies have also shown that simple informal methods of communication can really effectively foster these relationships and help the overall student experience. So what do these efforts do to the relationships and the overall school community? Well, students derive a great strength and support from their culture. So having a teacher that is willing to learn about their culture actually helps them in the classroom and beyond. So it is so important that we form relationships and value students' non-dominant culture instead of viewing any differences experienced as a resistance to learning. Also, we want to provide the opportunity for families to be involved. So whenever possible, lean into those relationships. Have the families represent the cultures that you are teaching about or utilizing in your classroom. Also, we want to embrace students' cultural capital through innovative classroom methods so that we can keep things engaging and relevant to student learning. Now we are going to look at how we can implement what we've been learning through best practices within classroom management.
All right, so we've gotten to that point of the presentation that maybe brought you here, and we're gonna think about some best practices in the classroom. And we really all see this flowing from a culturally responsive conception of caring. And Emily is really passionate about this subject, so she's going to go into more detail about that, and then I'll take us back into some best practices that we can do in the classroom.
Yeah, so I'm really passionate about this because whether or not students perceive that their teachers are caring really matters for their learning and their education. And research has shown that different cultures think about caring differently. And that has an impact on whether or not a teacher is perceived as being caring. And we know from research that perceptions of caring teachers have big implications for student motivation. So if students think that their teachers care, they're going to be motivated, they're going to be engaged, they're going to want to learn. If they don't, then they run the risk of disengaging, feeling alienated from school and learning, and that is just something that we don't want. So in order for us to show our kids that we really do care for them, because we do, but that might just be lost in communication or perception of caring. So in order for them to really understand and pick up on the fact that we care, we have to show we care in ways that are culturally appropriate to them. And so Jess is going to talk a little bit more about best practices of how we can do this.
Yeah, and like I said, all of these practices that we've kind of put together from our research really stem from this strong conception of caring that's culturally responsive and relevant for your students. And from there, it really emerges these three things that we suggest that you do. Have high, clear expectations, employ a warm demander approach, and reimagine your conception of respect in the classroom. So at this time, if you're interested in a toolbox of strategies that we've put together, go ahead and pause the video and scan the QR code at the top left-hand side of the screen, and you can follow along as we talk about these practices. And you can also find some other resources that we've included too. So, okay, let's begin with a clear and high expectations. One example of this, and there are many, but one example of this that we've come to is speaking in statements, not in questions in your classroom. And I have a little story that goes along with this. So imagine this. You're an elementary teacher like us, and you have a student who is playing with scissors in your classroom. And we all know that that is not a safe practice for them. So we want to stop them from this, right? And you might be tempted to say, in maybe a really kind of nice or sweet voice, "Now, where do those scissors belong?" But maybe a culturally responsive teacher might say, "Please put those scissors back in the green box now." Those are totally different things. But we would argue that the second option is something that would be better for a culturally responsive classroom management plan. Next is the warm demander approach, and Emily's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so similar to what Jess was saying about those maybe different ways of saying the same thing, that also applies to a warm demander approach. And so warm demander is this term that has kind of been coined in research about finding your teacher voice. And of course, like we've been saying all along, this is going to vary with any classroom, right? This is going to vary across cultures, and we can't make general statements. But when I entered into my school community, I grew up with teachers who were all super sweet. They smiled all the time. They spoke softly. They downplayed power. And so I kind of thought of that as someone who cared and someone who was a good and a nice teacher. And then I quickly found out that that wasn't working that well in my classroom. And as I watched other teachers in my school, they spoke in a lower tone. They were more direct. They were stern. And the kids really responded well to that. They loved it. They thought those teachers cared, and they expected that. And so I think I faced my own assumption that a nice teacher is really soft-spoken, quiet, sweet. And I think that my kids really showed me that in order to be a nice teacher, and especially in order to be an effective teacher, you really have to look at the culture and the culture of your school in terms of management to find out what is culturally appropriate for your students.
Yeah, and sort of going off of that to our final example, I have quite a similar story that goes along with reimagining respect in your classroom. And when I entered the classroom, similar to Emily, I brought in my own ideas and conceptions of respect. And for me, respect meant silence, it meant hand raising, it meant eye contact, and these are all things that I saw in my schooling, so I brought those with me. And as I entered the classroom, I also assumed that I would be given the full authority because I was the teacher, and that was just the way it was. And I really felt quite perplexed and just disappointed when my students did not respond to that. And in fact, we're doing maybe the opposite of that. And I felt like they were pushing my limits. But research reflects that these expectations that I had were actually centered around white middle class values of respect, power, and authority. But I didn't know that. And for the majority of the year, I continued on with this management style that reflected how I had been socialized to act as a young white female teacher. And this left me feeling really quite disappointed and disillusioned with teaching and kind of unsure if I was cut out for the job, which is just an awful, awful feeling. And when I started to observe the teachers around me, just kind of like what Emily was saying, I found the ways that they implemented their versions of classroom management were really different than mine. And I had a lot more success with my own management when I learned from them. And I watched my coworkers and their warm demander approaches and learned that I could cultivate equitable learning experiences and a community of care when I kept in mind my cultural context. And that's really what we urge you to do. And as we continue on and kind of end our conversation, we wanted to leave you with a final thought that contextualizes our why behind the culturally responsive classroom management framework that we want you to consider employing in your classroom. And I'll read the text on the slide for us as a closing thought. And it says, the creation of socially just and caring learning communities in the classroom in which both students and teachers' voices, experiences, and perspectives are recognized, respected, and incorporated benefits everyone and everything. And ultimately, teachers teach better and students learn more. And that really is our goal. So we hope you enjoyed our presentation and that you learned a lot. Thank you so much for watching. And we look forward to continue this conversation in our Q&A very soon. So thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.